Okay, this is a first call to come back here. If we could come back in about a minute and have a seat. All right, thank you so much. The next topic is on the Amish Farm and Home from 1875 to 1900 by Ruth Miller Yoder. And I wasn't able to be here last year, but the appreciation that was expressed by the members of the committee that were here, they were really appreciative of what she shared and how she did it. And we asked her if she would consider doing the same sort of thing again this year, and we're grateful that she agreed to do it. So I asked her how she'd like to be introduced. Well, she thought everybody here who ought to know her probably already does. And so with no further ado, Ruth Miller Yoder, retired and a retired social worker. Glad to have her here and sharing with us this evening.
So Scott, this thing unclipped and I put it back on. Did I do it right? Okay. Okay. I'm not used to being tethered. Good evening. Come, step across the threshold of an Amish home in the mid-1870s. The design and details of this home exude plain and simple, even though in recent years some conveniences have changed household appearance and labor. But mother and grandmother continue to bustle about, directing children in age-appropriate tasks, preparing meals, baking bread in the outdoor oven, making trips to the ice house, heating water on the stove, and performing many other tasks related to homemaking and nurturing. Adolescent boys spend most of their waking hours with their father and older brothers, learning how to care for animals and land. Delighting in farm work, Amish children, and I quote, love to lead or ride the beasts harrowing or cultivating, bringing cows in from pasture, feed the hens, drive off crows. They play hard too, but work is necessary to their happiness. This could hardly be said of the average non-Amish farm boy. He would rather go fishing. By 1875, canning of food was introduced locally, but vessels were earthenware crocks, not jars. The privy or shanty was not replaced by an indoor toilet until after 1900. Also by 1875, farm families started noticing the appearance of their homestead. More plantings were available. Trees and shrubs added a welcoming touch. Favorite flowers included zinnia, marigold, and peony. A historian notes that The geranium still is queen of the kitchen window. Memories sometimes play tricks on us. Age and experience may color our lens or dim it. But what a rich legacy is ours as we share bits and pieces of our past, such as this elderly man many years ago recalling threshing days when he was 15, old enough to earn money like a man. His job was to haul water for the steam engine. I had no idea, he said, how many barrels of water a steam engine could drink. He was on the run all day. Keeping the engine supplied with water was no small task. His pay was 50 cents for the day. Significant changes in 25 years. Our recent historian meetings have focused on 25-year increments with time spans far removed from us, and now here we are, gradually having inched our way to 1875 to 1900. Most of us remember folks born in that time period. We fondly recall stories told by relatives, neighbors, or friends entertaining us with the good old days. Because we can name a handful or more of these folks who lived during our lifetime, we may tend to consider their life experiences comparable to ours. The late Evan J. Miller, known to many of us, was born before the Model T was on the horizon. One Sunday morning, Evan's family was traveling to Oakdale in a 2-horse spring wagon. He told this story. We were in a string of buggies and carriages when someone in the front called back to my father, "Denkst du, McKenna vorbei? Do you think we can pass?" I was excited immediately. What kind of an outfit must be ahead if it was so big we could perhaps not even get past it? I knew nothing of autos. I did not even know there was such a vehicle. The mysterious obstacle, a steam automobile made by Milton D. Miller, carried their whole family. The horses did not think much of this horseless carriage, but we passed safely. I had seen my first automobile. It was a thrill. Lest we forget that making and keeping fire was not simply done by flipping a switch, turning a knob, or using a handy little wand, records remind us otherwise. Both Pete Opal and Harry Butler saw their first boxed matches around 1875. Starting a fire was not for adding ambiance to a cozy dinner. Mrs. Joel Beachy used to go down to the Cassleman River to get firestones, probably flint, to light her punk when the fire went out. One time she depleted her supply and had to walk miles to get hot coals to rekindle her fire. Although the kerosene lamp had replaced the candle in many places by 1870, not everyone had immediate access to this new invention. While Thomas Edison's electric light bulb had made its way into urban homes around 1880, many rural areas still relied on the kerosene lamp for lighting until after 1920. Kerosene was often of inferior quality, causing lamps to explode. A far cry, is it not, from our antique kerosene lamps that cast such a lovely glow thanks to the smokeless, odorless, soot-free kerosene in an easy pour container from Mark's harness shop. Differentiating Amish farm life from non-Amish farm life in the late 1800s is a hard call. Identifying what equipment was on the market then does not prove that either group used that equipment. If only a handful of Amish or non-Amish and non-Amish had kept a strict record, this assignment would be much easier. If only folks had listed the machinery, upgrades, and conveniences their family had utilized, this assignment would be simpler. But that is not the case, so this evening we will explore some diaries, ledgers, and stories to capture bits and pieces of Amish farm life. Were their farming practices markedly different from non-Amish in this community? Amish beliefs and dress were likely the most obvious distinguishing factors, but whether farming practices were different remains a question. What we do know, though, is that articles, ledgers, and stories have preserved snapshots of the past. For instance, Milton J. Beechey noted that when hand tools were used for harvesting, grain was tied by hand, using a handful of grain to form the band. He further wrote that the first self-binder tied the sheaves with wire in 1876. 12 years later, the knotter was invented, and sheaves were tied with twine. Alta Schrock related this story about her great-grandfather, Moses Schrock. He had purchased his first grain binder from Grossman in Myersdale. One day, the proprietor asked, "How is your grain binder working?" Moses replied, "Not so good." The proprietor then asked, "How so?" To which Moses answered, "Well, when the twine is all, it won't tie." Family Stories by Magdalena Beechey and Sisters. Daniel and Elizabeth Beechey's daughters could not have known their journals would someday be available at our local archives. The Beecheys have enlightened historians, entertained readers, and answered as well as raised some questions. Throughout this presentation, we will look in on the Beecheys periodically through their journals in the late 1800s. The Beecheys moved their young family in 1853 to what we know now as the Gortner, Maryland, and Aurora, West Virginia area. Daniel, an Amish minister and bishop, suffered dreadfully from epilepsy. His spells impacted their farm and family life. He was not able to do the strenuous work required in farming, but hard manual labor was no stranger to these Beechey sisters. Fanny reported that one July day in 1892, they picked 12-gallon raspberries. Several days she raked wheat stubbles, helped bind around the barley, raked hay, helped her sisters pick the geese, and worked very hard shocking hay while the men brought in the last load of wheat. On September 9, as Fanny and some of her sisters were returning from picking huckleberries, Lizzie ran to meet them, telling them to detain Kate for a bit. So Lena somehow maneuvered Kate to the barn. They followed with their berries and hats on. "We only got inside the door," wrote Fanny, "when there was a yell, a roar, and a shower of berries. There sat Barbara Schwarzentruber, Jonas Miller, and Milton Hirschberger." He had his eye on Kate. These unexpected visitors were reason enough to take the next day off work and enjoy a drive to Baker's Mill. That evening, the young people trekked to the hill where, in Fanny's words, they watched Jupiter rise and slowly ascend the heaven. Often work did not end after supper. A February 1879 diary entry describes Lena and Lydia shelling dried corn all evening until bedtime. The next year found them one day binding oats in the big clover field. Farm work for the Beechey girls was not occasional. Lena writes, "Used the old reaper to reap the wheat in the big Schrock field. Lena and Leah helped bind the wheat." Less than 10 years later, the Republican newspaper featured several Amish farmers. Just a few miles from here at Maple Glen, on the farm now owned by Martin Bender, Peter Slaybaugh picked 224 gallons of strawberries from 1/4 acre of ground. Also cited was Rudolph Yoder's farm for a wheat threshing yield of 38 bushels to the acre. We ask again, the writer challenged, who in Garrett County can beat that? Also noted was John Brenneman, a believer in labor-saving equipment, for purchasing a hay loading machine from a manufacturer in Pennsylvania. We note that a portion of the Brenneman farm of accident is now home for Barry and Carol Most and Merlin and Lisa Beitzel. The newspaper touted Garrett County farmers for bringing their land up to a high state of cultivation. Now back to the Daniel Beachy farm, we find several entries depicting summer life. Lena hoed 8.5 rows potatoes. July takes us to the fields and a berry patch. Cradled around the wheat in big field on Schrock Place. Brought binder into wheat field. Cut 1 or 2 rows yet. Raked wheat stubble this AM. Helped bind around the barley. Finished hauling wheat. Had 22 large loads besides rakings. Picked raspberries. August signaled the end of summer. On the 2nd, they made applesauce for the first time and had roasting corn and tomatoes. Blackberries were bounteous. One summer day, Lena made 13 gallons of wine from berries. She wrote to be used only for medicine when needed, and needed is underlined. Another day, Kate and Fanny took their lunch across the hill where they picked 3 gallons huckleberries. That same day, as the men were bringing down a load of clover, an unexpected rain shower created a very slippery field trail. The wagon veered off the path. Something broke on the hay loader. The wagon careened, causing the load to overturn as the downpour continued. The men unhitched the wagon. They even rescued a puppy that somehow had landed under the load. On August 23, the Beaches threshed oats with steamer. 2 days later, Lena welcomed a rainy day. Just what we needed, she wrote. They cleaned chaff and filled bed ticks. She wrote she felt terribly cross all day. An arranged outing with town friends was canceled. Lena felt sorry for Leah, but did not show it, for Lena herself was out of sorts. On September 6, the Beaches finished threshing oats. The yield was 370 bushels. In 1892, they milked 10 cows twice a day, along with doing other barn chores. October and November were not months of respite. Husking field corn was finally completed. One November day included scrubbing the upstairs and digging white elephant potatoes. A neighbor helped build the furnace for the sugar camp. Noah borrowed an engine to grind and cut corn fodder. New Year's Eve found Lena grinding chop. The next year, the Beachy family maintained their busy schedule. Jake and a neighbor cradled wheat. Kate raked. Fanny bound the wheat. Then they reaped it with the binder. Jake cut a neighbor's wheat and Fanny mowed nearly all day. After Jake sharpened the scythe, Fanny mowed again. Lena and Kate sheared sheep. Jake reluctantly reaped wheat for a neighbor, reluctant because he had never before operated a self-binder. The Beachy Sister Diaries continue to reflect farm and field work. They churned, put up around 14 gallons apple butter. They picked 20 bushels apples. Lena and Fanny milked 17 cows. They fed the cows and 7 head of young cattle. The girls grinded chop and fed the sheep. One June day, they finished hoeing corn in the little clover field. Oh, it is in fine condition, only hoed about 2.5 days. In July 1894, the sisters did some spinning and mowed with machine today. Sisters and brother helped each other. That July, Lena wrote, Eli sold 8-gallon, 3-quart raspberries for us. The end of July 1894, the family and neighbors hauled wheat with 4 wagons. August 4 marked an unusual day of haymaking. Coming down the hill with the 46th load of hay, the horses would not turn as directed. The load slipped off the wagon, breaking the coupling pole. But by the 9th of August, haying was finished after 55 loads. But Lena did not stop working. By 5 p.m., she had finished hoeing corn, after which she spun 80 skeins. September meant fall harvesting. On the 17th, Lena wrote that the Eli Yoder family invited the Beachies that evening for ice cream. What better way to celebrate the end of a hot, hard day? Did they use a recipe for the ice cream? What topics, we wonder, did this little gathering generate as they relaxed in the cool of the evening? The impact of train service. Though noteworthy changes over time may cause our eyes to glaze over, there are too many changes to grasp contextually. Or historically, we may have memorized but not appreciated the impact of change. What role did transportation, for example, play in community development? Long before the advent of the automobile, trains rumbled into quiet Cassleman Valley. The railroad coming through this area created quite the stir. Population increased significantly, with coal mining soon competing with agriculture, according to historian Welfley. Already by 1880, excursions to Dan's Rock in Maryland were available daily, leaving Cumberland at 9:30 a.m. The train went to Lonaconing. Dan's Rock passengers got off at Vail Summit. At 5:30 p.m., the train departed for Cumberland. In Pennsylvania, the Niverton mine first opened in 1898. The first coal was shipped in 1899. Niverton included a large coal tipple, powerhouse, blacksmith shop, repair shop, harness shop, country store, and large stable for 30-some draft horses. Miners lived in whitewashed double houses lined up in 2 rows. There was no running water. Known for its stench, crime, and filth, Niverton was not considered an ideal neighborhood by the local folks, although coal was a valuable resource. Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's branch line from West Salisbury to the mine site added traffic and activity to the once secluded Elklick Township area. The Salisbury newsletter reported this schedule. Train will arrive when it gets here, leaves when it is ready. Transactions in business and homemaking. Farmers sought out repair shops when equipment required more time or expertise than father or sons could provide. One person's expertise was another person's gain. Trading or bartering was widely practiced, benefiting both buyer and seller. Harry Gelnett, a multi-talented man, was respected widely. He was a proprietor. He was also a Mennonite minister, serving along with Noah Miller and Milton Miller. These accounts occurred in 1887 and 1888, respectively. Customer Jonas Beachy owed Harry $20 for a black lamb, for building a shed, and for tearing down an old house. Harry was paid in straw, corn fodder, buckwheat, and timlock and hemlock timber, Another customer bought a single tree which took Harry 2.5 days to make. Harry also planted corn one day and sold 2 pigs to that customer. That bill, about $7, was paid with 1,000 feet hemlock timber, 50 cents, and the use of a buggy. Business transactions noted in ledgers were largely the domain of men, but women who managed a household were stewards of much more than meet the eye. These women were not limited to four walls. Outdoor work such as gardening, weeding, and harvesting was taxing, but only a small part of their realm. Helping with barn chores when men were in field or woods was common. Fletcher noted, and I quote, "The farmer's wife milked, lifted heavy crocks in the spring house, skimmed off the cream, churned, washed and packed butter, usually took it to market, in addition to the other multivarious duties as mother and housewife." Mothers were modeling caregiving daily, whether nursing a feverish child, preparing a meal, baking bread, removing a splinter, or serving as a midwife. Evan Miller, in paying tribute to Elizabeth Beitzel, noted that her family exemplified pioneer life of their day. They wove their own cloth, made many dyes including brown from walnuts and yellow from hickory. Some folks roasted and grinded rye to make their own coffee. They dried cherries, huckleberries, apples, and some vegetables for winter use. Socialization in work and leisure. Amish families in the late 1800s deemed work and thrift more important than leisure and fashion. But work-related events also provided comradeship, fellowship, and mutual benefit. Threshing was not only men gathering to harvest, but neighbor women gathered to help prepare the bounteous meal for 20 men, sometimes 20 or so of them. Barn raisings, butchering, and auctions also provided time and place to socialize. Gathering nuts, cracking nuts, cutting rags for rugs, hooking rugs, quilting bees. These and more continue even today in Amish homes. Doing good, having fun, and incurring no financial burden is an Amish recipe needing no revision. Young people had their own recreational events too. Sunday evening singings in homes offered, and still do, both spiritual food and social interaction. Lena wrote about other special gatherings too. For instance, she attended a rag cutting at the Eli Hirschberger home where they had a good turnout. That evening they sang till midnight and talked even later. They pushed 2 beds together where 5 girls slept. Laughter, reminiscing, and dreaming were woven into the heartbeats of the young. One day, Milt Hirschberger had spent the day with Daniel Beachy's son, Jake. After a pleasant afternoon boat ride, the two continued enjoying their day of leisure. Day turned to evening, but still, Milt did not go home. There were stories to tell and more memories to make. Milt remembered, and I quote, the time they built the pike to the river. A large dish of soup was prepared for the men's dinner and set on the ground when, jump, jump, came a big toad down the bank and landed right in the soup. A letter from Ida Hirschberger noted her upcoming 15th birthday. She was keeping house while her parents were on an 8-week trip. Lena, 29, included in her journal this tender philosophical note. I suppose the world looks very bright to Ida, as it should, but may she be gently awakened. Winter sledding and sleigh rides in the late 1800s were common. Of course, we remind ourselves how else before the advent of the automobile would a family travel in snow. A sleigh ride then was not always for pleasure. Sometimes a sleigh ride in harsh weather was of dire necessity. No one had insulated underwear or jackets, or socks and mittens heated by battery. There was no protection from howling winter blasts, no handy button to push for heating sleigh or sled, and no comfort measures for horses struggling in deep snow or fighting against frigid, howling wind. The week between Christmas and New Year's Day afforded time for celebration and visiting and play. An entry by Lena summarized this special time. She wrote, "What a good time we had that week, hooking a rug, going to Smith meetings, they were good, and playing blind man's buff." Challenges and marvels in nature. With automobiles not yet on the scene, travel was often risky, sometimes nigh dangerous. Extra chores and vigilance were also part of winter. Harvey S. Yoder's references of 1898 and 1899 included a day when it snowed about 50 inches. One day he took the sled out to break the road. He sawed ice. The next day he and Lewis put away 5 loads of ice. He put sawdust in the ice house. On November 17, 1892, the Beachy Journal notes, "A fierce snowstorm is raging. Put the cattle in the stable, have 70 head to tie, 50 in stable, 18 in shed with top over. Must stick them in some place. We put them all in shed. Have 14 calves in calf stable and 7 little ones in cow stable." And a week later, this entry appears. "Snowing and storming brought the cattle down from the Schrock place. Oh, terrors, what shall we do with them? Fanny and I tackle them and bring order out of chaos in time. Took us till noon to fill the stables. Tied 51 head, have 6 left over, turned 2 in with the calves, the other 5 in the shed. Seems to me I can't sleep for fear they will hook each other." Other winter weather notations include unexpected snowstorms, family travel by sled, frigid temperatures, area-wide sickness. Even their overnight guests became ill. But amidst all the havoc, glimmers of pleasure emerged, such as, "Sledding is splendid." Lest we imagine that the Beachy family, Evan Miller, Elizabeth Beitzel, Harvey Yoder, and others experienced a natural environment similar to ours, the following descriptions of the late 1800s paint some stark differences. W.S. Livengood recalled that passenger pigeons were not only common, but plentiful in the Salisbury, Pennsylvania area. Livengood and his father hunted these birds, a welcome addition to their common table. One unforgettable pigeon flight was a day when the birds, heading for Maryland, filled the entire sky for at least an hour. The sun, he wrote, was darkened by them as by a cloud. Historian Scharf described this land as only partially settled and offers superior advantages for farming and stock raising. Immense forests exist. Then he went on, "The invigorating air is relished alike by the robust and the delicate. And one of the enjoyable sensations in summer is a sound night's sleep under blankets when those who are compelled to remain in the cities are sweltering from excessive heat." In some places, panthers and bobcats stretched out on cut logs in the warm sun. Harold Miller remembered a favorite sunning spot for these cats near an old sawmill on a tributary of the Cassleman River. In 1892, Lena Beachy heard her first whippoorwill on May 2nd. Few of us are privileged to hear that nostalgic call from our front porch. Oh, to join once more our grandparents or parents in singing the whippoorwill song. The maple sugaring season was longer, or at least later in the late 1800s, than our season today. In 1894, Lena wrote that April 14 was the best run of sugar water yet this year. The Beaches had installed a sugar evaporator in 1883 and boiled sugar water on Good Friday. Lena worked in the camp. The kettles seemed to hold more than the evaporator, so she went home for advice and agreed to eat supper before returning to the camp. As she approached the camp after supper, she smelled smoke. It was dreadful, Lena wrote. She contained the fire with water from the big tub, but the fire had caused a leak in the pan, curtailing syrup making during repairs. That year, they sold a gallon of maple syrup for 75 cents. Gid Miller in 1890 invented a new style pan designed to save 40 to 50% on fuel. This pan boils much faster and makes white sugar, according to the advertisement. 7 years later, within a few months, Gid made 18 improved sugar pans and 8,000 improved spiles. Mark Ware notes that some farmers 10 years later were still using wooden keelers, even though galvanized buckets had been introduced about 20 years earlier. Tin spiles, too, were gradually replacing wooden ones. Family matters of life, health, and suffering. Although farm life and food production cycled with the seasons, families were not immune to hard times and tragedies. They did not have access to quick assistance in emergencies. The year was 1889. The Christian Yoder family of Elk Lick Township was robbed by a band of masked men from Fayette County, Pennsylvania. After taking his money, they forced Christian to the barn, where they brutally tortured him. In the 1880s, 3 families, neighbors to the Beaches, lost their homes to fire. And then just before Christmas, Mrs. Schrock died. The next year, 11 weeks after Mother Elizabeth Beachy died, Sarah Selders died, and Lizzie took over the care of the motherless infant boy. Soon thereafter, Martha Grady died, leaving an infant daughter. Lydia went to help the Grady family. In September of 1880, the Beachy family experienced a farm accident. Simon and Sarah, in a covered spring wagon, were hurt when their horses ran away. The wagon was demolished, but the baby was unscathed. Daniel and Elizabeth went to the rescue. Sarah was hurt right badly, but Simon was able to sit up, they wrote. Those were awful, awful days, wrote Lena, noting that Sarah was thought to be near death. Harry Gelnett, introduced earlier in this presentation, suffered a life-changing tragedy. While working in his sawmill, his right wrist was cut off. He was carried to his yet unfinished house. There on the kitchen table, the doctor amputated his arm above the elbow, hoping to prevent infection. The operation was done without anesthesia. The family never forgot his screams of agony during the amputation. On June 1, 1893, Lena wrote, "Sweet month of roses, but alas, cannot ward off sickness and death." Her proverb still stands. Breathtaking beauty is powerless to hold at bay human vulnerability and mortality. Savannah experienced an electrical shock when lightning struck their house. The next day, her stillborn baby was born. After the burial, no one felt like singing, but Clyde Snyder honored the request of the baby's siblings, Elmer 9 and Flossie 6. He played his mouth organ. And now we wish we knew what song blessed that somber moment. How did families arrive at recipes for ailments? Some may have been handed down from previous generations. Some may have been created by trial and error. An eye salve ointment recipe dated November 23, 1882, is found on the first page of Joel J. Miller's ledger. Take the white part of 3 boiled eggs and add 3 pulverized cloves to each egg. Add sugar of lead. The amount would stay on your fingernail. Then put it on a rag and press the juice out of it and bottle it. Add enough sugar lead to cause a little burning. Another recipe calculates how to get proper doses of medicine for children and is signed by physician B.T. Keller and Joel J. Miller. The Beacheys grappled with Jonas's worsening illness. School days in 1875 were happy days, except that Jonas used to have such terrible sick spells, such pains that he had to sit up long hours of the night. Serious problems persisted. An eventual trip to Morgantown, West Virginia for treatment for dropsy proved futile. In 1877, Jonas was critically ill with pneumonia. During one episode of relentless pain, Jonas was tended by Sister Tilly, who applied a pepper poultice. Jonas's problems were chronic, critical, and escalating. The next year, a sister noted, "Jonas is quite cheerful, but Mother is very anxious about him." Then comes this information, February 5, 1879. At 5 a.m., Father came upstairs to tell us Jonas is very poorly, probably dying. The family had moved his bed down into the room where Father and Mother slept, and Mother waited on him as only a mother can. Mother Elizabeth awoke in the deep of night to Jonas praying the Lord's Prayer. Lena reflected, "Poor dear mother, God only knows what she suffered for her firstborn." Jonas was 29 when he died. The 1890s were rife with sorrows too. Mother Elizabeth died in January of 1892. Absent in the journal is acknowledgement or sentiment of Mother's dying and death. Grief, no doubt, was too deep for words. But 6 months later, Lizzie wrote to a newly widowed cousin, now the sole parent of 7 children. Her loving support is evident in this excerpt. "I know by experience it is awful sad and lonesome to lose so dear a mother. We seem to be crushed to the ground with sadness. I almost wonder how we can stand it at all, but I believe it is given to us to overcome." The next year, Jacob came down with a very painful leg condition. His sisters, already managing the home without Mother, tried to comfort Jake while also taking on extra farm chores. One night, the doctor and family did not expect Jake to survive. Lena wrote that Jake suffered terribly, writhing in agony and writhing his hands. It was almost unbearable to see him, according to Leah, who described Jake the next day as stuporous. "Oh, what will become of us?" Lizzie seems to be losing ground, too. Only 2.5 years after Mother Elizabeth died, Lizzie's earthly life ended at the age of 29. Let us join Lena in her grief. "I kneeled down by the still, cold form. A strange calm possessed me. Not a tear came through. There was anguish in my heart. I could almost smile when I looked at that calm, lovely face and know it was well with her. My blessed guardian angel, Sister Lizzie, has gone to her rest. And oh, it seems like losing Mother all over again. Oh, I was stunned. It seemed like a terrible nightmare." Lizzie's funeral was August 28, 1894 at 3 p.m. Lena wrote that Sammy put a large armful of ferns in the grave before it was closed. At last we turned away, she reflected. Our Betsy was indeed gone. How everything about house and garden speaks of her. Rain falls and the sun shines on the just and the unjust. Tribulation and heartache are no respecter of persons. Hilda Glassbender endured many a struggle. Her husband, John, had a serious drinking problem. The family's physical needs and financial status bore witness. But then one summer day in 1898, her situation took a sudden turn. Hilda became very sick. The doctor said she needed hospital care. Her pains became too severe to endure the bumpy carriage ride. So the driver stopped at the Joel J. Miller home, where several men constructed a stretcher to carry her to Frostburg. The caravan took the spring wagon along. Half the crew rode and rested, while the other half took their turn carrying the stretcher. The evening trip on foot commenced on July 3, with the entourage arriving in Frostburg the next morning at 4 a.m. The last leg of the journey was by train from Frostburg to Cumberland, just as the sun was coming up. Hilda survived the excruciating trip, but she died on the operating table. Now we return to the Beachy family. It is July 10, 1894. 3 graves are scheduled to be moved from the Lake Farm to the Schrock Place. Lena describes this happening, and here is part of her script. Sammy Wotring brought our little sister Susie and our 2 little brothers, Moses and Danny, who had been buried on the Lake Farm under the locust tree. Sammy and Mr. Spiegel brought the remains to the Schrock Place and interred them all in one grave. They cultivated ground over them just the same as the rest of the field. Sammy had some difficulty in finding them all. He said there was nothing whatever in the little coffin but a little dust. The coffins were considerably decayed. I believe it is 23 years this summer since the last one, Danny, was put there. Ah, dust to dust. Yes, life to death, dust to dust, and God in his eternal heaven looks down in mercy on his children from one generation to the next. In 1875, we met Daniel Beachy, 55, Elizabeth, 50, and 11 of their children. 3 babies had died, bringing the total number of children to 14. And now, fast forward 25 years, 5 daughters have married. Gathering around the evening supper table, we find this remnant: Father Daniel, Jacob, Leah, Lena, and Fanny. Their days were numbered, as are ours. Our days reflect our hopes and fears, our faith and our doubts, our confidences and our uncertainties, our joys and our sorrows. It was son Jonas Beachy who, as he lay dying at the young age of 29, left an indelible legacy. In his frail, mortal state, he cried out to immortal God. Jonas remembered this world was not his home. He reached to his God of eternity. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.
Thank you so much for that interesting, stirring, and sometimes sobering look at life in those days. I just always am reminded how much I take for granted. Go to the cupboard, pop a Tylenol or an ibuprofen, if there's some kind of an ache or a pain. They didn't have that. didn't exist. If there's a problem, you can call an ambulance. No, you have to take somebody on a stretcher on foot. So much that the world has changed over the last 100-some years. Thank you. Questions that you might have, or comments, thoughts that came to you in that sharing. There are microphones. Just raise your hand and they'll bring one to you. While they are maybe thinking about that, I have one. You mentioned towards the beginning of your topic that they did canning in earthenware containers, vessels. Now I'm familiar with canning in glass jars in a water bath, or even, I suppose, metal cans. But did they do something similar in earthenware? Does anybody know? Or did they have to seal the tops with wax or something? Do you know?
I don't know.
Does anybody know? Can you can? I mean, I guess you can. They did. But I mean, how does that work in an earthenware container? Does anybody know? Yes, if somebody could give her just one moment. Wait till you get the microphone. Right there. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
I remember when we butchered, when I was a child, Grandma had the big earthen crocks, and that's what they put their meat down in,
Okay.
especially the sausage.
Mm-hmm.
And she would seal it then with the lard.
Okay.
But she also can, but then a lot of the meat was put in earthen jar.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. All right. Anybody?
So Ruth had mentioned about Harry Gilnett having an accident and then having his arm removed. I invite people to come over to the Springs Museum from 9 to 3 tomorrow. We have his wooden arm there that had a hook on it, or he had a hand that he could move the thumb and the finger to do things. We are also open October 4 and 5 at the Spring Folk Festival from 9 to 5, if anyone would like to see that.
Thank you. 9 to 3, you said, right? Tomorrow? Okay. Okay, last call. Thank you. Please join me in giving her a round of applause as well. I enjoyed that so much. And before we dismiss, I would like to lift an offering for the expenses of the weekend. If Bernard and Leroy will just come up here to the front and lift that offering. And perhaps while they do that, I will say that I found another thing that she mentioned in there about the weather, the cold winters and so on that they had then. And I know that from the 1600s to the to the 1800s was a time in the northern latitudes when it was particularly cold. They call it the Little Ice Age. It's not really an ice age, but north of the equator, the northern Atlantic, was particularly cold, and nobody's really quite sure why. Lots of ideas, but nobody seems really sure why. And so one of the coldest times during that was 1850. And so coming from 1850 into 1875 and towards 1900, it was just starting to warm back up from one of the coldest times during the cold time, known as the Little Ice Age. And so it's not surprising that they had such chilly winters. And today, if they show how the world has warmed up in the last 100 years or so, they invariably start from 1850, which is the coldest time of the Little Ice Age, to show you how it's warmed up. And you would expect it to have warmed up because it was so cold during that time. So that's neither here nor there, other than I just found that a very fascinating reminiscence. All right, thank you for that. For those of you who shared, we appreciate that. There are refreshments downstairs. You're welcome to go down, enjoy them, and chat about what you've heard, or talk to our presenters. Would you stand with me, and let's ask the Lord's blessing on our evening. God, thank you for being with us this evening. Thank you for people who loved and served you in a time that was very different than ours, but still human people like us with their joys and their sorrows. Thank you for the faithfulness of the people in their walk with you that were mentioned this evening. And as we reflect back on the times that they lived through, and you were faithful then, and we trust you to be faithful with us today in our time as well. Bless the remainder of our evening. Would our fellowship be glorifying to you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, you are dismissed. Go enjoy the refreshments.